Hello book lovers and welcome back or welcome to Nat Cat's Bookish Cafe. Today I'm here to go through all the books that I DNF'd in 2023. Alright guys, we are approaching the end of the year. I'm actually filming this here on December 26th. Hopefully there's no DNFs between now and the end of the year, but at this time I have exactly 10 DNFs, which I think is not too terrible a number. I definitely don't want this number to be at 0 because it means I'm forcing myself to finish books that I'm not enjoying. Obviously, not every book you pick up is going to work for you. I have read over 150 books this year, so I feel like 10 is a pretty small percentage. I am still a relatively new to being a DNFer, but I think I'm getting a lot better at it as I do it more and more. Obviously, I have a huge TBR and I don't want to be wasting my time on books that I'm just not feeling. That being said, obviously, if you enjoyed these books, that is totally okay. I will say most of these books I DNF'd relatively quickly because I just decided they weren't for me, and so I don't really have any hate towards these books. It just was not the vibe for me personally, and that is totally okay. I am going to be going through these in the order of which I read and DNF'd them. Also, I have to admit, I'm going to be a little bit lazy. I'm not going to reacquaint myself with the synopsis or the character names. Not that I ever do with the character names, but I just wanted to let you know that I'm probably just going to talk a little bit about why I didn't like these books. If I do say a little bit about the book, that's great. If not, you can always look it up on Goodreads or Storygraph or anywhere else. All right, and we are jumping right into the first book. Luckily, I didn't DNF any books in the month of January, so we started off the year strong. However, I did DNF 2 in February. The first being Meet Cute Diary by Emery Lee. This is a YA story featuring a trans main character, and this was unfortunately a book that I didn't hear the greatest things about. I almost want to say that I read it for a punishment prompt to read one of the lowest rated books on my TBR, and I kind of think that it deserves to be there. Now, I didn't start tracking my DNFs until later in the year, so I didn't mark specifically when I DNF'd this book, but it was around the 100-page mark. Later this year, I did give Emery Lee a second chance with her Café con Leche book, I believe it was called, and it did a little better, but one of the things I realized that caused me to think maybe Emery Lee is not the author for me is that I don't love their characters. In fact, I quite dislike them, and I'm a very character-driven person, so a story where I'm just not feeling the character is not going to work very well for me. One of the issues I also had with this book is that it is a fake dating situation, and I felt very uncomfortable with the way that the, I'm assuming, love interest was treating our main character. There were kind of these scenarios where the love interest was pushing our characters to do certain things because that's what a couple would do. So like, hey, we should kiss now because that's what a couple would do. And I always felt like our character saw a little bit of a red flag kind of blowing in the wind, but then they were someone who was very romantic, and so they would think, oh, this is something that would happen in like a romance book or something, so I'm going to go along with it. And I was always like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like if you feel uncomfortable with it when it's first brought up, then you shouldn't talk yourself out of being uncomfortable. So that whole situation was just a little weird for me. Plus, I think the book was almost 400 pages, and after I got through 100 pages, I just realized I couldn't do 300 more pages of it. The other book that I DNF'd in February was also a second chance author, and that is going to be The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh. In this case, this was me giving the author a second chance because I DNF'd her Dawn and the Dagger book, I want to say it was called. This was just one of those situations where I realized that the story was probably just going to be too YA for me, where I wasn't going to enjoy the writing, where I wasn't going to enjoy the characters or the decisions or the behaviors of said characters. And so I actually ended up DNFing this book at about 14%. By the way, sometimes I'll give a page number and sometimes I will give a percentage, kind of depending on if I was listening to it via audiobook or reading it physically. This is, I believe, a YA historical story that involves vampires. Renee Ahdieh is a book that I really enjoyed when I was younger with her Flame in the Mist duology, but now that I'm older and her newer stuff is unfortunately just not working for me. I really just think that I have outgrown her work, and otherwise I don't really have anything bad to say about it because I just haven't read enough of the book. It was just really that I realized that I was no longer in the age group that would primarily be enjoying the story. Moving into March, I attempted to read a book club book, and that is Briefly a Delicious Life. I cannot remember the name of this author, but the cover of the book should be right here. And I believe I DNF'd this around the 50% mark. Once again, I was not tracking my DNFs yet, and I guess I did not make a note of when I DNF'd it. This is a historical literary fiction paranormal story where we are following a ghost that has been haunting an abbey, I want to say, for quite some time. And one day a woman, her two children, and her lover show up, and we kind of watch as this ghost falls in love with this woman, but we also get to see a little bit about the ghost's past, as well as read from the point of view of this woman and the lover, and probably also the children. I was just bored. I have to be completely honest, I DNF'd this book because I was bored out of my mind. I think that you just have to be really interested in this time period, or maybe in very character-driven books. And occasionally, you know, a character-driven book is great if you care about the characters. And the only one that I really cared about was our ghost. I found her past very interesting, but we so hardly went back in time. And when we did, we would just get the smallest of snippets from it, and it was just very frustrating to feel like I was starting to get interested in her past and then being thrown back into the future, which I didn't care about at all. So this was a DNF purely because it was boring. I mean, I do think it's well written and that the writing was really nice, but not for me. I'm just not a historical literary fiction girly at the end of the day. Up next, we had one DNF in the month of April, and this is actually the book I DNF'd the fastest at 28 pages, and that is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. And this, once again, I believe is a YA historical story. It might have some sort of fantasy elements in it, and I have to be honest, I read those 28 pages and I knew her writing just wasn't going to be for me. I felt actively annoyed by her writing and by the characters, despite having spent maybe like 2 pages with them. It's not often I feel so strongly against a form of writing, but it was just something like I knew right away. Like even after the prologue, after the first couple pages, I was like, I don't think it's gonna work, but we're gonna give it a couple more pages. And then I was just like, yeah, no, I'm sorry, I don't care. I'm not gonna put up with this, and it's not fair to the story. I will say I usually don't rate my DNFs. I only rated 2 of them. I should have mentioned Briefly a Beautiful Life. I did rate 2 stars just because I read a little bit over 50%. But books like this, I'm not gonna rate. They're not for me, and that's not fair for me to do that. Chloe Gong is probably just not an author I'm gonna check out again because it wasn't really plot or anything, because I didn't even get into the plot. It was just straight up her writing style. Up next, we are moving into June, and we had one DNF, which was Vicious Spirits by Kat Cho, and I believe I got about 17% through this story. This is the sequel to Wicked Fox, and Wicked Fox was a story that I really struggled to get into, primarily because I struggled to care about the characters. And it wasn't until we got towards the end and we saw them go through all their trials and whatnot that I was like, okay, now I'm really starting to root for these characters and I'm excited to get into book 2. But then we got into book 2 and we were following from the point of view of 2 other characters who I instantly, once again, did not really like. And I was like, we're not going through this again. We're not going through a whole nother book where I don't like you guys until the very last page. I have to admit, I wasn't super interested in the overarching story either. The plot of the first book was meh meh to me, so I decided that I just was gonna go ahead and give up on this duology. Moving into September, we went into another DNF, which upon looking at my spreadsheet is actually the one I DNF'd the quickest. That was a lie earlier with These Violent Delights. This one I DNF'd after 19 pages, and that is The Confessions of a Young Nero by Margaret George. This was me picking it up so that I was one of those historical girlies, like an actual historical story based on a actual historical person. I wish I could be into it. I really do. I wish I was smart enough. You know, I wish I had the patience to read about this person's life. I just don't care. So that is why I put this book down. I think I initially put this book down with the intention of picking it up again, and then decided, hey, I've been pretty happy, you know, not having to worry about picking this book up again. So we're going to go ahead and just DNF it. I think at the end of the day, I still occasionally try to pick up books that I feel like will make me seem like a more valid and intellectual reader, but you know, I'm not enjoying the experience, so it's not doing anyone any good. All right, then we get into October, in which I had 2 DNFs. The first of which was Sundial by Katrina Ward. I DNF'd this after 66 pages. This was one of the books where I started it and was like, uh-oh, I don't know if I'm gonna like this, because there was a cheating trope in it and it was pretty prominent and I was just not having a good time with that whatsoever. However, once our character removed herself from that situation, she removes herself and her daughter from her spouse and takes her daughter to her old homestead in the desert because she feels there's something wrong with her daughter. But once they got out there, I was kind of like, you know what? I'm actually more interested in your domestic issues, because this whole situation is boring the crap out of me. Once again, we are just dealing with a story that I found incredibly boring. I had no interest in what was happening, what had happened in the past. The author was clearly trying to be like, hey, something weird happened here. And I was like, I don't care. So the author just wasn't able to attract my attention. Every time she was focusing on something, my mind was kind of like, well, what about this over here? And I was never interested in what she wanted me to be interested in. And so I figured it just wasn't going to work out for me. Katrina Ward is definitely one of those authors I would love to give a second chance someday. I think this is one of her less spoken about books. So hopefully The House on Needless Street will work a lot better for me. The next book I DNF'd in October was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and I actually DNF'd this at 74%, meaning that this is the book where I got the furthest way through the story before I decided to cut it quits. This is a Gothic novel set in Mexico. It's supposed to have kind of like nature horror in it, which is something I usually really enjoy. We have a kind of haunted, effed up house situation with a very old family that sees itself as superior to all around them, and it seemed like it would be a good vibe. But Silvia Moreno Garcia is a author I have tried in the past and I just did not enjoy her writing, and that was the case here as well. I think that her ideas are excellent. It's just I struggle with her execution. I found myself very disinterested in the story. I was not really rooting for our main character. I didn't really feel scared at any point. However, The reason I DNF'd it was because there were a few what I would consider kind of sexual harassment, sexual assault scenes. Nothing too extreme, but considering there was nothing else in the story that was really grabbing my attention, that was kind of the point of the book that was sticking out to me. And during one of those scenes, I just decided that I had had enough and that I did not want to continue with the story. I really wanted the nature horror, the fungus horror, to be the part that was grossing me out, but really it was just the men in the story, and I was like, I can be grossed out by men out here in the real world. I don't need to do it here in this kind of boring story. Moving into November, we have another Hispanic Gothic novel that I DNF'd, and this is Vampires of El Norte by Isabella Cañas. This one I DNF'd at 42%. I had read this author in the past. I read her book, The Hacienda. I gave it 3.5 stars. I thought it was a decent time. I enjoyed the romance aspect of it. I enjoyed the setting of it. My problem is that her books just didn't evoke any feelings of discomfort and fear as I feel like you should feel during a Gothic novel. Reading these last two books, I have to admit, made me question if Gothic novels are even something that I am interested in. And I was warned that this book focuses a lot more on romance rather than on the vampires that are present in this book. I unfortunately was once again just missing any sort of creepy, crawly, eerie, unsettling feelings that I wanted to get from this, what I'm assuming is like a slow-paced horror story, and I found myself incredibly bored by what was happening. We are almost halfway through the book and I feel like very little has happened and the story is just starting to pick up at this point, and I was like, let's get a going here, guys. I also feel like the vampires made a few appearances at this point, and I felt nothing. And also I did not like our characters, especially the female character. I felt she was very immature and that she was being very unfair to the male love interest. And overall, I think that even though the characters are young, I think they're in their early 20s, I felt like this story very much read like a YA story, and that's not at all what I was looking for. So it was completely not the vibe. I was hoping that if I tried one of this author's books via audiobook that it would just bring the vibe, but unfortunately that was just not the case. Moving on to the last book, which is good because I am definitely losing my voice. This is not the first video that I filmed today, but the last book is The Princess Dearest Guards by Bo Van Dalen. And this is a novella, fantasy, romance featuring a trans main character. Yep, that's right. My first and last DNF of the year featured trans characters, which is very unfortunate because usually I have a pretty high success rate when it comes to trans representation in books. But in this case, once again, it was just the writing style. I do struggle a little bit with novellas, especially when it comes to romance, especially smutty romance, because when it comes to steamy scenes, I really rely on emotional connections. Maybe it's the demisexual in me, but I can't just have people start banging left and right and being like, do you know anything about this person? Like, do you know their maiden name or their favorite color? Anything? I also felt like I had to suspend my disbelief a lot for this story. We are obviously following a prince as well as his two guards. So it's polyamorous. I usually love polyamorous stories, but the way that the guards were talking to the prince, I was like, never would they ever. And they had only known each other for one day and they had never met before that. So it's not even as if they were all just friends or anything like that. They didn't know each other. So there was no reason for them to be saying these things. And while I understand with a novella that you just gotta get on with the story real quick, I felt like the author definitely should have taken a bit more time building the characters' relationship a little bit more. It was just all very sudden. They were suddenly in the shower together. Suddenly the prince was wanting to be submissive, and so I was like, wait, is this kind of like a BDSM thing? The prince never mentioned that he was interested even in his thoughts or anything like that. So it was all just very rushed, and there was also some wording choices in there that were leaning a little bit towards grody. So I am unfortunately not able to recommend this book, but once again, I don't want to discourage anyone from reading any books, especially ones by self-published authors. Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned, but I only got 36% through this book, and it's only, I think, like 101, 102 pages long. All right, guys, so those are all the books I DNF'd. Hopefully next year I don't DNF too many, but once again, I am really working to make sure that I don't spend too much time on books that I just don't care about. The good news is I don't feel like I DNF'd any of these books because they are problematic, so I feel like you are totally safe to check them out if they are something that you are interested in. I would love to know down below what books you DNF'd this year. Do you DNF? Are you someone who just powers through? Are you someone who says, I have to read at least 50% of the book or the first 100 pages? And as always, thank you so much for supporting my channel by watching my videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!